So we'll talk about essentially two key parts of the hidden curriculum. And then after kind of going through this idea of what is the hidden curriculum, we'll talk about how to be your own advocate, and then also how to build a team of mentors that can support you in getting the help that you need to be successful, both in graduate school and also in your careers. And then we'll open things up at the end for any additional questions that you have about the book or about the hidden curriculum or going to grad school, especially in these kinds of uncertain times. So, why this book? Before we get into this idea of the hidden curriculum and why it's hidden, I think it's helpful for me to tell you a little bit about, especially for those of you who have taken a look at the book already, kind of where this came from. And along those lines, back in 2018, PhD student Kristen K. Smith had tweeted about the need to better educate grad students or better educate undergrads about graduate school opportunities. And reflecting on her tweet made me think about sort of the opportunities in academia and how they are often hidden from graduate students as well. Essentially reflecting on my own experiences in grad school, I was thinking about the number of times that I'd found myself embarrassed because of all the things that I didn't know. Not knowing, for example, the difference between a working paper and a paper that's forthcoming, or not knowing certain shortcuts to use with statistical software, or not knowing the meaning of words like pedagogy or dialectical that I heard sort of thrown around in class, or not knowing what it means to write an effective literature review. And so essentially, I shared those stories on a Twitter thread and encouraged other scholars to do the same. And ultimately, hundreds of scholars ended up sharing their stories. Stories about not knowing that you can get funding to do a PhD program, or bumbling the names of famous theorists when they were talking in class, or standing awkwardly in the back of a reception at a conference, sort of not knowing who to talk to or how to navigate those kinds of conversations. And so I started collecting all those stories in a spreadsheet, essentially grouping them by different themes, the way that I typically do in a lot of my qualitative research when I'm doing interviews or when I'm doing ethnographic observations in schools, and thinking through sort of what are the themes, what are the key patterns here. And essentially, what I had at that point, even though I didn't quite know it yet, was an outline for the book with each of those different themes in what people were sharing, representing one of the chapters that ended up in the book as a whole. And in the meanwhile, Megan Levinson, who's an editor at Princeton University Press, had seen the hashtag, had seen these stories being shared on Twitter, and had reached out to ask if I'd be interested in turning those tweets and kind of the discussion around them into a book. And at first, I was a little hesitant to do so. I had just published at the time my first book. I also had a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old at home who took up most of my extra energy at the time. At the same time, I'd already written a number of blog style pieces, mostly for my own students, reflections on things like how to outline and write effective research papers, how to give effective conference talks, things like how, when you're teaching, to encourage students to engage in in-class discussions. And so I figured at the time that it wouldn't be too much extra work to flesh out those kinds of ideas into a fully formed book. And of course, it was more work than I anticipated, but that kind of writing to teach effectively, as opposed to writing about research specifically, I find it especially fun. I think it's a more conversational style of writing, and I hope that comes across in reading the book. I hope not too dry to get through. And so I'm glad I stuck with it, and that because of that, I do get the chance to share this book with you. And so along those lines, sort of what's the book about? For those of you who haven't read it, it's tries to explain why so much of the key knowledge in academia feels so hidden, and also uncover key parts of that hidden curriculum of grad school, while also giving students the tools that they need to uncover the rest for themselves. And so that's kind of one piece of it, is very student facing. Another part of the book is trying to push faculty and administrators to recognize how hidden the hidden curriculum is, and also to do the work of dismantling the hidden curriculum and making it part of the formal curriculum of instruction instead. And so that gets us to the question of, so what is this hidden curriculum? Essentially, the hidden curriculum of grad school includes all the knowledge and skills and strategies that you're expected to know in grad school, and that will ultimately matter for success in grad school, but that aren't typically explicitly taught. So that could include everything from deciding whether you want to go to grad school in the first place and how to make that decision, to choosing a program, finding effective mentors, how to ask those mentors for help when you're struggling or when you're not sure what to do next, It also includes things like how to stay on track in your program, how to study efficiently for things like qualifying exams, or get funding for your research, or present and write about your research in compelling ways, as well as things kind of toward the end of your program with how to network and connect with people in the kinds of fields that you might be interested in pursuing job-wise, or how to turn your degree into the kind of career that ultimately meets your needs and helps you get where you want to be. And so essentially, knowing these things, knowing these parts of the hidden curriculum can help you be more successful in graduate school, or at least have an easier time making it through grad school. And it can also help you be more successful career-wise in the long term as well. And that begs the question, if all of this knowledge is so critical for student success, both in graduate school and beyond graduate school, why does so much of it stay so hidden? Why isn't it part of the formal curriculum instead? Why aren't these things that all graduate students are taught kind of as part of an explicit training program? And so essentially with that why question, one of the reasons is that essentially the hidden curriculum of graduate school stays hidden in part because academia doesn't reward faculty, at least externally reward faculty, for being the kinds of teachers and mentors who help their students develop key knowledge and skills. Instead, most of the big rewards in academia are all attached to research. Universities with graduate programs, especially those with large PhD programs, are often called research universities or R1 universities. And at those research universities, faculty members or professors are hired and promoted based almost entirely on their research, and not in many cases based on things like teaching or mentoring or service. And so professors who do more research and more prestigious research within those kinds of academies usually end up with more money, more awards, and more opportunities in academia. And so what that means then is that professors who teach at universities with graduate programs have relatively little incentive, or at least external incentive, to focus on being good teachers or good mentors. Certainly there's some incentive to be a good teacher at the undergraduate level, especially if you're at a school where department funding or program funding is determined largely by undergraduate enrollment. But there's relatively little external incentive to be a good teacher at the graduate level, and especially for students who are pursuing PhDs or other doctoral type degrees. And that's because most PhD programs, especially at large research universities, are actually paying students to get their degrees. And as opposed to the other way around. And certainly that money is good for students, though it's almost never enough for students to even meet their basic needs sometimes. But what that means is that PhD students usually have relatively little leverage to demand the kinds of effective teaching and mentoring that they deserve and that they often need to be successful in their programs. Instead, and oops, got a little too far ahead of ourselves. Instead, and because of the reward structure of academia, professors arguably have an incentive to pick winners. So what does that mean? It means recruiting and working with and investing in grad students who seem like they'll be able to succeed in academia from day one with relatively little support. And we can think about which students those are more likely to be. They're disproportionately going to be students who come in already knowing the hidden curriculum of academia, or who essentially, oftentimes because they have people other than their professors, maybe friends or family members, oftentimes multiple generations of extended family members, that they can ask for help in navigating these kinds of situations. Or, as we'll talk about in a minute, because they have a sense of entitlement to ask for help from their professors, either in undergrad or in grad school, to help them navigate what they don't know. Now, that kind of picking winners model, it's good for professors in the sense that if professors invest in students who come in already knowing the hidden curriculum, those students won't need as much help from their professors, which means professors will then have more time for their own research, and maybe they'll be able to rely more heavily on those students to be able to jump in and support professors with their research as well, which ultimately then serves the goal of professors' research getting done and getting done more quickly and getting done well. At the same time, we can think about why that picking winners model might be deeply problematic, especially for students from systematically marginalized groups. So why is this hiddenness a problem? Essentially, academia, or at least the version of academia that we have in the US today, was designed by and for wealthy white men. Certainly, the demographics of academia are changing with more people of color, more people from low income or working class backgrounds, more women, etc. But there's certainly still a lot of progress to be made. And academia's history and status as a privileged and privilege dependent institution continues to shape how easy or how difficult it is for different students to navigate the hidden curriculum of grad school. First, I mean, students from more privileged groups are much more likely to come in having friends or family members who've gone to college, who've gotten a PhD, and those students are going to come to grad school already more familiar with the hidden curriculum, the hidden knowledge of academia, the ways of doing things, the key terminology, all the structures of success. I mean, and certainly my 6-year-old daughter probably knows more about academia than I did when I started college, and maybe more than I did when I started my PhD. And second, we have to think about the fact that, as I find in some of my other research, students from more privileged groups also disproportionately feel more entitled to ask for help, to ask questions, to ask for letters of recommendation, to ask for accommodations and support and flexibility. And that sense of entitlement starts early. It starts in elementary school or even in preschool. Essentially, because of their family's resources, students from more privileged backgrounds are treated with more respect and more deference in institutions. Educators often feel compelled to give them help and support that they desire, and they rarely shame those students or judge them for asking for help. And so, certainly by the time they get to college, those students oftentimes don't have a problem asking their professors lots of questions about grad school, about academia, about what they might be pursuing down the line. And certainly by the time they get to grad school, they feel very comfortable asking those questions, in many cases at least, as well, asking for things like feedback on papers, opportunities to work with professors, kind of putting themselves out there for awards and other types of opportunities. Meanwhile, students from systematically marginalized groups rarely have that same sense of entitlement. Instead, and because of how they and their families are often treated by institutions, students from systematically marginalized groups often worry about being seen as a burden on others, about how they'll be judged if they reach out or ask for help from others, and especially from people in positions of power or authority like their professors. And so ultimately, then, because of the unequal structure of our schools and our society, students from systematically marginalized groups will often need more help uncovering the hidden curriculum of academia. But they will also disproportionately, at least, be the ones who find it more difficult to ask for the support that they need to navigate those kinds of hidden structures. Ultimately, then, the hiddenness of the hidden curriculum reinforces inequalities in academia, and it tends to do so in two key ways. First, it makes it harder for students from systematically marginalized groups to be successful in their programs. When those students come in not knowing the hidden curriculum and without the sense of entitlement to ask for help, it can often lead to tremendous amounts of self doubt. We often think about that self doubt as imposter syndrome, sort of feeling as though everyone else gets it and you don't, and questioning whether you're smart enough or good enough to have gotten into your program or to have the kinds of opportunities that you have. And we know from research that that kind of imposter syndrome can be tremendously harmful for students, making it difficult to stay motivated, making it difficult to believe in their ability to do the work. Essentially, then, when students are struggling with imposter syndrome, they need effective, dedicated mentors to help them see their own value and learn the knowledge and skills that many of their peers may take for granted. Unfortunately, though, and as I mentioned before, the structures of academia mean that many faculty members have relatively little incentive to be the kinds of teachers or mentors who take the time to systematically uncover the hidden curriculum for their students, and especially for the students who need the most help in uncovering that curriculum. And meanwhile, there are certainly mentors who do make that time. And those mentors we know also from research are disproportionately scholars from groups that have been historically marginalized in academia. Scholars of color, women scholars, LGBTQ scholars, scholars who were first generation college students or who grew up in working class homes. And that brings us to the second way that the hiddenness of the hidden curriculum tends to reinforce inequities in academia. essentially, because of the support that they provide to students, the faculty members who do invest time in being good mentors are often overburdened with requests. And that kind of excess burden of support can make it difficult for faculty, and especially faculty from systematically marginalized groups, to be successful in their own careers, to invest the time in their own research that is necessary to get tenure or to get promoted to full professor or to even keep their position, especially if it's a research-driven one. And so essentially, if those scholars are denied tenure or promotion or pushed out of elite institutions, then it can make it harder to change the unequal structures that keep the hidden curriculum hidden and that make that hidden curriculum so harmful for students from systematically marginalized groups. And so that raises the question of what should we do if we know that the hidden curriculum is hidden, and if we know that the hiddenness of that hidden curriculum is hurting students and hurting faculty, then what do we have to do? So I argue in the book that we need to change the structure of incentives in academia. That means teaching faculty and future faculty to be good teachers and good mentors. Many PhD programs, for example, don't require students to get any training as teachers or mentors, even when the majority of their students do go into teaching positions or positions that involve some sort of teaching or mentoring. I'd argue that we also need to reward faculty for doing the work of being good teachers and good mentors and good department citizens, at the same time with the recognition of how biased things like teaching evaluations can be. And maybe most importantly, then, we need to change the incentive structures in academia. That means things like ratcheting down the expectations for faculty research, lowering expectations for the number of publications or the number of grant dollars that faculty are expected to secure. Unfortunately, though, those research expectations aren't just arbitrary norms that we can change. They're a function of the way that higher education is funded and structured in the US today. Over the past 40 years, states and the federal government have systematically de-invested themselves from higher education, shifting the cost of running universities, and especially public universities, from taxpayers to universities themselves. And that de-investment has forced universities to raise tuition, kind of pushing those costs onto students and their families. But unfortunately, even sky-high tuition rates aren't enough for most universities to be able to make ends meet. And so to make up the difference, universities find themselves chasing grant dollars from the federal government and from private organizations that fund faculty research. Certainly some of that money goes to doing the research itself, but some of it also goes back to the university to pay for all the systems and support that faculty and students take for granted in many cases, everything from maintaining buildings to staff salaries to library books. And so essentially then, given how dependent universities have become on grant funding and the research that goes into getting that grant funding, a radical shift in the structure of incentives in academia is hard to imagine, at least without a massive reinvestment in higher education from the federal government and from states as well. And that's especially true right now with the recession creating even stiffer competition for the few academic jobs that are available. Essentially, that kind of competition, when we have so few jobs and so many PhD students finishing with their degrees, it ratchets up the expectations for research even further and further reduces the incentives for faculty to focus on things like teaching or mentoring instead. Thankfully, though, there are things we can do in the meanwhile while we're maybe working toward that kind of a more radical shift in this incentive structures of academia. Specifically, I'd argue that schools and departments and universities need to work to dismantle the hidden curriculum and make it part of the formal curriculum instead, much like what we're doing here today. Essentially, making that hidden curriculum part of the formal curriculum helps students get the knowledge they need to succeed, regardless of who they have as their advisor. And making the hidden curriculum part of the formal curriculum arguably also helps faculty by essentially reducing the burden on individual professors to have to uncover that knowledge for each student of theirs on their own. At the same time, though, the work of making that hidden curriculum part of the formal curriculum, I would say that it's really important for that work to come from faculty and administrators. Certainly, grad students can and should push for change within their departments and with universities as a whole, but grad students and especially PhD students are in a particularly precarious position, especially right now. We've seen that with injunctions filed against students at the University of Michigan for protesting being forced to teach on campus, or we've seen that with the firing of PhD students at schools like UC Santa Cruz over trying to unionize last spring. And so essentially because they're in such a precarious position, dependent in many cases on their programs for funding and on their advisors for sponsorship in their careers, PhD students are tremendously vulnerable to pushback, even if they're pushing for the kind of support that they desperately need for success in their programs. And so along those lines, one of the things that I try to do in the book is to offer a resource for departments and programs that want to take steps toward making the hidden curriculum part of the formal curriculum of academia or of grad school. And of course, I mean, one book, even a pretty hefty long book, can't explain everything that students need to know to be successful in their programs and in academia more generally. There's just too much knowledge to cover, especially with how the specifics of the hidden curriculum can vary across different disciplines, different universities, different programs, different degrees. That said, there are some parts of the hidden curriculum that are pretty widely applicable, things you'd benefit from knowing whether you're getting a PhD in history at Harvard or a master's degree in engineering at Mississippi State. And so that's essentially what I try to do and talk about in the Field Guide to Grad School. It's focusing on those sort of widely applicable parts of the hidden curriculum and helping students develop the kinds of skills and strategies that they need to uncover the rest for themselves. And so along those lines, I want to talk about sort of two key parts of the hidden curriculum that I think are pretty widely applicable and hopefully helpful, especially to students who are at an early stage of their program. So first, let's talk about finding a good advisor. This is a question that I get all the time from grad students. How do I pick a good advisor, especially if we know that knowledge of the hidden curriculum is so dependent on or who you have to be your mentor? And along those lines, I think it's really important to note that there isn't a single kind of professor that makes a good advisor for grad students. And it's also important to note that expecting one professor to provide all the support that a student needs in grad school is probably far too much to ask. And that's why I encourage students to build a team of mentors rather than try to find a single professor who can meet all of their mentoring needs. In the book, I sort of lay that out as a series of categories of people that you want to be able to fill to kind of make sure that you're getting all of your different needs met that you might have while you're in grad school. And that includes things like a topics person. This is probably going to be your primary advisor. It's someone who works not just in your field, but in the kind of subfield that you're interested in contributing to with your work. And that's important because that person is really helpful for making sense of where your research will fit into the relevant debates within your subfield, and also to identify the kinds of key contributions that you can make with your work, essentially helping figure out framing, how to frame your research to contribute to what's being done, and help you make sure that you're not just replicating something that's been done before, though certainly replication is useful and valuable as well. You'll also probably want a methods person, someone who uses the kinds of tools that you want to use in your research, whether those tools are physical tools in a lab setting or technological tools like statistical software or theoretical tools like ways of thinking about research or data. When you are doing a dissertation project or a master's level project, you will almost certainly run into problems related to the gathering and analyzing of evidence. And having someone that you can turn to in that process and say, hey, this program isn't working or this machine is stuck. What do I do next? Is tremendously helpful and really important for getting timely feedback, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. And this doesn't, I mean, in many cases, this could be a faculty member, but it could also be other grad students. Oftentimes, I know certainly in my own department, we have a computer lab that a lot of our grad students hang out and work in. And there's a couple of grad students who kind of are the sort of statistical advisors to the rest of the students in the department. It's sort of a rotating cast of characters that changes as the cohorts change. But that kind of peer support that you can get sort of instantaneously is really helpful. And so building those connections and being grateful to the people who do that service work within the department. And if you can't find those folks in your department, even looking outside as well, oftentimes you'll have sort of statistical consulting groups on campus, or you'll have sort of best practice kind of lab advisors with people that you can turn to get advice on using the tools that you're using, even if other grad students or your faculty members can't help you with the specific questions that you have. Another key person to have on your team is an advice or planning person. This is essentially when you're thinking about graduate school, and especially now, given the competition for academic jobs, you'll want to have a variety of different career options in mind as you're moving through grad school. And you want someone who, on your team, who respects the various possibilities that you might be considering and doesn't judge you for the kinds of choices that you want to make. And that person is critical because they can help you figure out whether to, for example, spend your summers finding an internship with government or nonprofit or in the corporate world, or whether it makes more sense to spend the summer working with faculty members on research instead. Depending on the kinds of career options that you want open to you, those different kinds of decisions might make more or less sense. And so you want someone who can sit down with you periodically, ideally at least once a semester, maybe even more than that, especially later on, to think about, okay, what's my 5-year plan? What's my backing up from my 5-year plan? What's my 1-year plan? What do I need to do next semester? What do I need to do this semester? What should I be doing next week? And having that sort of mapped out, even if it's going to change down the line, can help you make more strategic decisions to figure out which options to invest in for yourself. It's also really helpful to have someone on your team who writes really well. And this doesn't even have to be a person that you know. Oftentimes, you can find a piece of research written by someone in your field that you just really respect and admire, and use that as a model for your own writing. Figure out, okay, how did they structure this argument? Okay, how did they put these pieces together to make a logical and coherent whole? How did they talk about their evidence? And so having someone whose writing you can look to kind of time and again as a touchstone for your own writing can be tremendously helpful, especially when you're feeling stuck and not sure where to go next. And along those lines, and also with writing, it's really important to have not just one person, but a whole group of people who will give you constructive feedback. People who will take the time to read what you write and also show you how to make your writing as effective as possible. Also at different stages of the process. So you'll want people, there's different people who, some people are really good at sort of big picture feedback. They'll sit down with you and have a conversation about, okay, the framing here doesn't quite work. Maybe you're thinking about this literature, or maybe you could change the argument to do it this way. They're not the people who will oftentimes go through line by line and give you track changes, edits, and catch all the like grammatical mistakes. You want to save those people for the end of the process, right before you're ready to submit for peer review. And so figuring out kind of building a team of people who will give you feedback on your writing, and then deploying those folks at different stages of the process to make sure that you're getting feedback all along the way. And that's another place where peer support is tremendously helpful. Certainly, I had a writing group that I was part of in graduate school, and I still turn back to many of those colleagues when I have a piece of writing that I'm like, I just need eyes on this draft before I send it out, or I'm just starting off with this draft. Can you give me some feedback? And they certainly ask the same of me. And so that's the idea: is that when you have people that you can turn to again and again, and just return the favor in providing constructive feedback on their writing as well. And giving good feedback can help you become a better writer in the process too. And then another key person to have on your team is someone who is well connected in your field. This, in an ideal world, in a non-COVID world, would be someone who would take the time to walk around with you at conferences, to send emails, maybe more accurately now, to send emails and kind of introducing you to people that they know. And this is becoming increasingly important, especially with the tight job markets, and especially with more and more students moving into non-academic jobs as well. So finding people who can be on your team who know the areas where you are interested in getting jobs. If you're interested in industry jobs, if you're interested in nonprofit jobs, having someone on your team who has placed students in those fields previously is really helpful because they have the network connections that can help you get a job in those fields. And then the last person that you want on your team is, or maybe multiple people, are people who will listen and listen supportively, especially when things don't go as planned. There's a really terrific book called Someone to Talk to by sociologist Mario Small. And it's technically about who people turn to when they're going through disruptive moments in their lives. But the case study that he uses is first-year graduate students. And essentially the book is all about sort of networks and how people make decisions about who to talk to. But the case studies, listening to these graduate students tell their stories about the challenges and the struggles that they're going through in their first year of graduate school, oftentimes moving to a new city, not having friends, trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, trying to figure out how they're going to research, navigating, finding mentors. I mean, certainly those struggles are very real. And so the more that you can find people to talk to help you through those moments, whether that is a faculty member or peers in your graduate program or a best friend from home or a partner or your mom or a therapist, having someone who can talk you through those tough moments becomes really important, especially because academia can often be an unforgiving place, especially when it comes to sort of harsh realities of rejection and things like that. So certainly, and in terms of mentors, some professors might check more than one of those 7 boxes, but it's pretty rare to find one professor who can check all of them. And even if you're lucky enough to find one of those sort of magical unicorn professors who can do all of those different things well, there's a good chance that that professor is probably pretty overburdened with requests already. And that's part of why it's important to build a whole team of mentors, and also why it's important to include on that team not just faculty members, but also other grad students, staff members, people outside of academia, like a therapist or a partner or a close friend as well. At the same time, though, and even if you have a terrific mentor or a whole terrific team of mentors, that doesn't necessarily mean that your mentors will just tell you everything that you need to know to be successful in graduate school. So, for example, to think through it from a math perspective, you might only have one or two or three advisors, but your advisors will each often have 5 or 10 or 15 students, even more than that in some cases, along with their own research and teaching and service and commitments to keep track of. And so what that means then is that your advisors aren't constantly thinking about you or your research or what steps you need to take next to be successful in your careers. Even though the reverse is often true, that you're often worried about what your advisor is thinking of you, the reverse is that like it doesn't happen the other way. And so instead, your advisors, for the most part, will probably assume that you don't need anything from them unless you either explicitly ask them for help or they can see that you haven't asked for help in a while, even though it looks like you might be falling behind. And so the problem here is that for many students, and especially for students from systematically marginalized groups, as I kind of alluded to before, asking for help can be really, really difficult. Maybe, for example, you're reluctant to ask for help because you're worried about how you'll be judged for asking, or because you're worried about feeling like you'll be a burden on others with your requests, that they already don't have enough time and you hate to add more to their plate. And certainly, I can understand why you might feel that way. I hate asking for help, and I often wait too long to do so. I'm not great at taking my own advice on this. But that waiting, even if you're spending time trying to figure out things on your own, it what it often means is that it takes you longer to do work that your peers can breeze through, either because they came in knowing the hidden curriculum or because they feel entitled to ask for help. And unfortunately, if it takes you longer to figure things out on your own, then your professors might end up assuming incorrectly that you're not invested enough in your careers. And if your professors think that you're not invested enough in your own success, they might be less inclined to invest in you. And so ultimately, then, if you want to get the most effective support from your team of mentors, you have to be your own advocate as well. So, what does that mean? What does this kind of self advocacy look like? It means actively looking for ways to help yourself get ahead in your career, and then also speaking up and asking others for help when you find that you're in a moment where you can't get there on your own. So let's kind of break this down. So first, looking for ways to help yourself. So if you want to help yourself get ahead in your career, you first have to know what kind of career that you want, or at least which options you're willing to consider. So knowing your options career-wise can help you better plan which next steps to take to get where you want to go. If you want to go the professor route and get a job in academia, then you'll probably need to invest more of your time in research and writing, presenting at academic conferences. You'll probably want to apply for more research fellowships and apply for or submit yourself for more kind of academic awards. If instead you want a job in the corporate or the nonprofit world, publications and fellowships probably don't matter quite as much. Instead, for a job in those fields, a summer internship might ultimately be what it takes to get you in the door with the kind of career field that you're interested in. And so your advisors probably won't just tell you which of those paths to take, even though in some cases they might have strong opinions about which they prefer. And they probably won't just create a roadmap for you with every step that you'll need to take along the way. And certainly, thankfully, you can do some research on your own. You can find recent graduates who have the kinds of careers that you're interested in pursuing and take a look at their resumes, essentially do some sort of investigative research to figure out what they were doing at your stage of their careers and what they did after that. And who did they intern with? Where did they publish? What kinds of awards and fellowships did they get? The answers to those questions can then be a guide for you in developing a plan for your own career. Of course, though, even if you do all that research, you might still find that there are some questions that you can't fully answer, or some steps that are too difficult to take on your own. Maybe you're not sure whether you want to go the academic route or the non-academic route, or maybe you need a letter of recommendation for an internship or for a fellowship or for an award. Those are the moments where it's absolutely critical to ask for help, or at least one set of moments. So what are those moments? How do you know when to ask for help? I'd say there are two key situations where asking for help is especially essential. First, when you find yourself in an impasse, when you literally can't get to the next step in where you want to go without support for someone else. That includes situations like needing approval for things, needing to take a particular course and needing a professor to sign off or a staff member to sign off, or needing to get certain institutional approvals for a particular research study. It also includes situations like needing a letter of recommendation for a fellowship or a job or an internship. Those are really clear cases. The second set of cases of help seeking situations are a little bit harder to identify. Specifically, you want to ask for help when you find yourself toiling away at something and feeling like it's taking you longer than it's supposed to take, or longer than it seems to be taking your peers. Maybe, for example, it's taking you forever to figure out how to write the statistical code for your master's thesis. Or maybe you know that you're supposed to be writing your dissertation proposal, but you've barely written anything because you're just not sure where to start. Certainly, there are resources that you can find online to help you through those moments. There are blog posts walking you through the basics and even the not so basics of statistical stuff, or suggested outlines for dissertation proposals. But if you're finding it hard to find those resources or to translate those resources for your specific case or your specific research, and if your efforts to do all that work are setting you behind your peers, then it's a really critical sign that it's time to ask for help. Because your professors won't necessarily know all this work that you've been doing behind the scenes. They'll only see the sort of outcome that you're falling further and further behind your peers. And so they might end up incorrectly assuming that you're just not working at all or that you're not even interested in working, which probably couldn't be further from the truth. In those moments, then it's critical to reach out and ask for help, because timely support from your professors and from other people on your mentoring team can help you both get back on track and avoid falling off in the first place. Of course, though, it can feel embarrassing to admit that you're struggling or that there's something you don't know, especially in a field like academia with so many people who love to essentially peacock and show how smart they are. But your professors will probably think more highly of you if you ask for help that you need, than if you disappear for months at a time or get frustrated with the whole process and end up needing an off ramp instead. So, of course, though, knowing when to ask for help doesn't help with overcoming the guilt or the awkwardness that you might feel in making those kinds of requests. And on that front, I have sort of two suggestions, or maybe three. So, first, remember that the work you're doing is valuable and important. You have so much to contribute. You wouldn't have gotten into your program otherwise. And that means that you deserve the support that you need to do your work and do it well. So, think about asking for help as an investment in your own future success. And think of it also as a way to help your university and your department and your mentors get a bigger payoff for their investment in you. Second, if you find yourself struggling with how to ask for help, look for templates. The book, A Field Guide to Grad School, includes a bunch of email templates, suggested language you can use if you need help figuring out next steps career-wise or asking for recommendation letters, or if you have to tell your advisor that you're thinking about switching advisors. I included those templates after seeing actually a PhD comic depicting the difference in the amount of time that grad students spend crafting an email versus the time that professors spend crafting their email responses in return. And it so accurately captures the sort of stress levels on both sides. Essentially, because of the power dynamics of academia, it often feels like there's so much at stake when you're asking a professor for help. And those stakes can make it harder to send that email or make that call. And my hope is that having some sample language can give you a place to start and make it easier to feel confident just clicking send on that email. And then third and finally, please don't feel guilty about needing some of your professor's time. Certainly, if you find yourself overly dependent on one mentor or advisor, it might be a good sign that you need to expand your team, but you shouldn't feel like you're burdening us with questions or requests, especially if that information or support is something you need to be successful in taking the next steps in your career. It's our job, it's part of our jobs to be your teachers and your mentors, even if that work isn't as valued as it should be. So I'll leave things there for now and open things up for questions. But thank you all for listening, and certainly thank you for your time. All right, let me pull this back up here and stop sharing my screen and so I can see all of you.